Chapter 1. Birth of a Crime Family Part 1. The Marcelins. 1. Old Man Bruce discusses the Marcelins. This opening scene from The King's Omen, Chapter 1, operates as both an exposition and a tonal manifesto, blending oral storytelling, intergenerational myth, and psychological analysis. It's not merely a dialogue, it's an initiation. The conversation between the aged Bruce Edwards and the reporter establishes both narrative structure and moral framework for everything that follows. Structural function. Framing the confession. This scene is built around the confessional device that anchors much of the novel's later moral excavation. The interviewer serves as surrogate for the reader, a controlled witness guiding Bruce into recollection. When Bruce warns, "From here on the story gets very deep, tragic, and graphic," he's setting terms for a descent, not just into memory, but into culpability. The dual temporality, present-day dialogue intercut with narrative flashbacks, echoes the story's broader exploration of history as trap. The reader is positioned alongside the reporter as co-recipient of a painful oral history, whose digressions blur guilt and justification. The symbolic awkwardness of Bruce adjusting his clothes before speaking about Cleotis Marcelin is revealing. It shows a man whose instinct is still to present himself properly to sin, to approach moral rot with reverence. The scene reminds us that confession is never pure. It's always partly performance. Thematic framework: pride, heritage, and moral legacy. The core of the conversation is pride, its origins, distortions, and inheritance. The reporter's insistence on tracing Bruce's self-image through his lineage reframes the usual gangster trope of rebellion. Here, crime is not revolt, it's legacy. Pride functions as both virtue and infection, a hereditary gene, as Bruce calls it, that binds him to the sins he claims to escape. The journalist's recitation of Bruce's distinguished and morally mixed ancestry serves as a genealogical mirror, lawmen, preachers, business owners, and criminals all emerging from the same root. Williams uses this to articulate the novel's dialectic of dual inheritance, the idea that righteousness and corruption are branches of the same family tree. When Bruce agrees, "I think most men are very prideful," his tone slides from confession to universality. Pride becomes less a personal flaw than a masculine archetype. The implication is that patriarchy itself, regardless of profession or morality, perpetuates cycles of control and self-destruction that define his family. Tonal duality, oral rhythm, and documented realism. The language here deliberately mimics documentary realism, casual, anecdotal, peppered with colloquial syntax. Yet within it lies meticulous rhythm. The repetition of generational names, coupled with Bruce's meandering but emotionally precise digressions, gives the dialogue the feel of an old blues song, cyclical, mournful, hypnotic. The prose emphasizes contrast between everyday phrasing and mythic content. Bruce recounts moral collapse the way one might describe an old family business, producing an unsettling intimacy that blurs horror with nostalgia. The introduction of Cleotis Marcelin, myth in the making. The turn from the reporter's psychological probing to Bruce's recounting of Cleotis Marcelin marks a shift from confession to lore. Structurally, it serves as the novel's hinge, from domestic introspection to the criminal epic that underlies it. Bruce's meticulous recounting of Cleotis's rise gives us an early taste of how The King's Omen treats violence as legacy and career. Cleotis's biography unfolds like an inverted buildings roman, early exposure to power, moral desensitization, familial loyalty gone wrong. The detail of his father Chamberlain's crimes and Cleotis's early complicity continues the motif of inheritance, showing moral corruption as both nurture and nature. The juxtaposition between domestic spaces, the grandmother's house, the kitchen, and violence, trafficking, beatings, street work, strengthens the story's central idea. Evil evolves in ordinary rooms long before it bursts into the public sphere. Note how Bruce's tone changes when narrating Cleotis. His words become precise, almost reverent. The respect, even tenderness, with which he calls him Mr. Marcelin underscores another key dynamic in this novel, the admiration of moral power even in its monstrous forms. Bruce's gestures, fixing his shirt, adjusting his pants, reveal that in telling this story, he is subconsciously submitting to an old hierarchy. Crime is order. This ambivalence, condemnation entwined with awe, is what makes Bruce a tragic narrator rather than a moral one. Thematic motifs emerging early inheritance of sin, both in family and mentorship, moral patterns passed downward uncontested. Pride as survival mechanism. Masculine pride doubles as armor and poison. It sustains identity, yet ensures isolation. Narrative as control. Bruce's command of story offers him illusionary mastery over guilt. Storytelling becomes ritual purification. Mythic realism. Facts blur into fable. Names, alliances, and street lore create a universe where morality operates like lineage law. Tonal and symbolic significance of the scene. This conversation reads as initiation into a much larger mythology, the pivot from Bruce's personal ruin to the grand architecture of the criminal world that shaped him. The reporter's moral curiosity and Bruce's fatalistic composure construct a dialogue between two Americas, one that observes and one that remembers. The act of adjusting clothing before speaking, the measured language of respect when referencing gangsters, and the insistence on storytelling decorum all underline a tragic irony. Order persisting even in recollection of chaos. By the end of the scene, readers understand two crucial truths. The Edwards family legacy is not a fall from grace, it is an inheritance uninterrupted. Bruce's confession will not redeem him. It will only complete the ritual of self-recognition that he's been performing all along. The Marcelin Brothers discussion. This flashback scene to Cleotis and his brothers is a masterclass in moral tension and character differentiation. It dramatizes the precise moment when external ambition clashes with the remnants of internal morality, turning the brothers' conversation into a philosophical and generational battlefield. The dialogue stands out for its realism and rhythm, its street logic rendered with almost Shakespearean weight. Structural and narrative function. Placed within the flashback sequence, this scene acts as the moral incubator for the future violence and corruption that define the Marcelin lineage. It functions as a prelude to corruption, a living anatomy of conscience under capitalist pressure. The simplicity of the setting for brothers talking is deceptive. It's an ideological council, building the foundations of tragedy. Each voice in the dialogue personifies a different aspect of human nature under duress. Cleotis, the reluctant criminal, driven by strategy and loyalty rather than greed. Cecil, the amorality of survivalism, the pure Darwinian mind. Charles, the quiet moral rationalist seeking a middle ground. Clavon, the full archetype, comic relief masking fragility, a reminder of innocence degraded. What begins as a logistical debate about a job evolves into a thematic discussion of conscience, loyalty, and self-preservation. It's not exposition. It's ideological theater, contextualizing how every act of violence in the King's Omen operates under justification first, regret later. Character and psychological dynamics. Cleotis Marcelin emerges here as both leader and moral pivot. His refusal to take the job at face value shows a rare ethical intuition within a world defined by transaction. Yet, even his morality is pragmatic, not humanistic. He opposes the hit not out of sanctity of life, but because murder doesn't sit right with strategy. For Cleotis, loyalty is still currency. His mention that "we just did a job for Dion 4 months ago" is not empathy, it's logic cloaked in decency. Williams uses this to reveal how in corrupted systems, even virtue becomes instrumentalized. Cecil, by contrast, is the embodiment of nihilistic ambition. His smirking, dismissive dialogue exposes the novel's philosophy of moral inversion. His belief that peace is only temporary and loyalty is for fools represents a generational fracture, the transition from tradition to modern ruthlessness. Cecil's voice anticipates the sociopathic ethos that will haunt later Edward's descendants, power without creed. His laughter and verbal dominance turn him into both instigator and prophecy. His amorality wins the scene because it's more adaptable to the world they inhabit. Charles functions as moral conscience, a quiet echo of the world's forgotten decency. He's the bridge between Cleotis's fading code and Cecil's nihilism. His rational restraint underscores the novel's tragic theme. Reason exists, but is always overpowered by loud ambition. When he says, "Seems harsh, even for us," it's a muted sermon from a man already resigned to futility. Clavon, meanwhile, introduces tonal contrast, comic ineptitude that humanizes the scene. His plea to go on this mission and Cecil's cruel banter ground the brothers in something grimly familiar, sibling cruelty as rehearsal for societal violence. The exchange about Clavon's incompetence lightens rhythmically but sharpens the irony. These men can mock morality and cruelty in the same breath. His blunders represent both comic relief and thematic reinforcement. Stupidity becomes innocence's last refuge in a corrupted ecosystem. Themes and motifs: loyalty versus profit. The heart of the scene is the dismantling of the old code. Cleotis's insistence that loyalty means something comes across as the last breath of gangster honor before markets and greed render it obsolete. Cecil's counterargument, "What kind of hitman has sympathy?" feels like Williams's rhetorical dagger. In this world, morality doesn't disappear, it becomes impractical. The generational shift in violence. The brothers represent moral evolution or devolution across a single lineage. Their dialogue compresses decades of societal rot into one moment of bickering. Cleotis stands for the fading era of codes, Cecil for the new breed of empty violence, Charles for conscience too weak to act, and Clavon for innocence doomed to mockery. Comic and tragic interplay. Williams blends humor with horror strategically. The comedy in Clavon's incompetence cuts the tension, but also reinforces moral numbness. Laughter becomes coping, and humiliation replaces reflection. The moment Cecil calls Clavon a certified bum encapsulates the story's emotional economy, mockery displacing empathy, hierarchy disguised as sibling banter. Fate and foreshadowing. Cleotis's final sigh and reluctant agreement to call him tomorrow is fatal punctuation. The gesture of resignation, after all his protestation, reveals how moral reasoning collapses under social inertia. In bad worlds, hesitation is already a form of surrender. His disgust towards Cecil's celebratory gesture seals the tragedy. Intellect watches power win. Symbolic and tonal observations. The setting, undefined but intimate, feels claustrophobic, emphasizing how moral decisions in this universe happen in cramped rooms, not grand offices. The absence of description beyond dialogue allows personality to paint atmosphere. Tone swings from weary to mocking to prophetic, mirroring the instability that defines all of Cleveland's underworld politics. The recurring sibling pattern throughout the King's Omen, love entangled with rivalry, reappears here in embryonic form. The brothers' conversation doesn't just foreshadow violence, it reenacts it linguistically. Cecil's words cut sharper than bullets, Cleotis's logic defends like armor, and Clavon's plea flails helplessly. The dialogue itself becomes bloodless combat. The scene's place in the larger narrative. This flashback deepens the tragic architecture of the King's Omen by showing the origin of methodology, how moral decay becomes policy. It's the moral blueprint for every Edwards and Marcelin tragedy that follows. In contrast to later scenes of Bruce's weary reflection, this one captures corruption in formation rather than aftermath. It also shifts tone from domestic guilt to systemic inheritance. After witnessing decades of consequence through Bruce's storytelling, readers now watch the seed being planted. One argument, one misjudgment, one job too many. The irony is clear. Cleotis's reluctance will later define Bruce's own ambivalence. Both men confuse morality with calculation and end up victims of the same design. Closing line interpretation. The scene's final image, Cecil celebrating as Cleotis looks on in disgust, capsulates the fatal rhythm of the series. Morality recoils while amorality celebrates. It's a dynamic that recurs across generations of the Edwards crime family, each time with less resistance and more despair. In this brief exchange, Williams gives readers both the anatomy of corruption and the prophecy of legacy, the slow, inevitable turning of conscience into commerce. 3. Bruce's talk with Roland's guidance counselor. This meeting between Bruce Edwards and Thurman, Roland's guidance counselor, is one of the most emotionally revealing and quietly devastating scenes in The King's Omen. After a long sequence of violence, pride, and generational trauma, this chapter recenters the story in the realm of human vulnerability. It reaffirms what the novel constantly suggests, that the Edwards family's tragedy isn't built solely on crime, but on failures of recognition, moments when love cannot translate into understanding. Structural and dramatic function. This scene functions as the moral interlude before Bruce's life fully collapses into the world of Lysandra Marcelin. It humanizes him without absolving him, positioning the school counselor as a moral foil, the first person in the narrative to articulate, plainly and without manipulation, what Bruce orbits but never says aloud. Structurally, the conversation between Bruce and Thurman mirrors the earlier conversation between Old Man Bruce and the reporter. Both are dialogues between confession and confrontation, but this one digs into Bruce's private guilt rather than his public myth. The pacing is designed around gradual, painful self-awareness. The dialogue begins briskly, Bruce pushing for a practical update, but devolves into raw exposure. Every line Thurman delivers dismantles Bruce's defenses one at a time until pride gives way to helpless honesty. The shift from short, clipped exchanges to longer, reflective passages signals internal movement. Bruce starts as a parent performing authority and ends as a man trespassing his own buried pain. Characters study Bruce Edwards. This scene dissects the emotional contradiction that defines Bruce. He wants to be a protector through action, working multiple jobs, providing structure, but he fails as a nurturer. When Thurman asks him, "What are your son's hobbies?" Bruce's fumbling response reveals not a lack of care, but a lack of intimacy. In that moment, Williams exposes the tragedy of masculine love shaped by socioeconomic exhaustion, affection reduced to duty, understanding outsourced to survival. The recurring image of Bruce rubbing his hands and knuckles reinforces his inner turbulence. His hands, instruments of labor and violence throughout the book, become symbols of guilt and uselessness here. They can build, hit, or earn, but they cannot grasp emotional truth. The closing gesture of Bruce seeing Roland's bruised arm transforms discomfort into despair. His silent observation, watching from the hallway, reveals both love and complicity. He is witness and perpetrator, seeing the physical residue of the dysfunction he unknowingly perpetuated. Bruce's silent exit from the school marks one of the novel's most haunting nonverbal climaxes, understanding arriving too late to save anything. Thurman stands out as the rare moral stabilizer in the narrative, a man versed in empathy, but grounded in pragmatism. His dialogue feels effortless, but profoundly philosophical. Lines like, "You don't get points for providing. What kind of parent wouldn't want to do that?" crystallize the novel's critique of survival as emotional neglect. Thurman's wisdom balances psychological realism with spiritual insight. He reframes parenting from financial provision to emotional presence, diagnosing both Roland's aggression and Bruce's suppression without passing judgment. His vulnerability, admitting his own struggles with his son, adds authenticity to the message. He is what Bruce might have been in another life, a man who learned to replace pride with compassion. Roland. Though mostly absent from the dialogue, Roland dominates the emotional aftermath. His off-screen presence, reduced to detail and gesture, carries immense symbolic power. The long-sleeved shirt, the hidden bruises, and the self-soothing massage of his arm all operate as visual shorthand for unspoken family violence and pain. Bruce knows Katrina was the perpetrator, but he is helpless in this cause. The sins of neglect and aggression have blended until no single act can be isolated. Roland's oblivious focus on his test contrasts starkly with his father's spiraling guilt, child and parent, both trapped in their silent performances of pain. Thematic analysis. Fatherhood and emotional illiteracy. The dialogue's central revelation, that Bruce cannot describe his son's talents, exposes how paternal pride erodes emotional communication. Masculinity in this story is survival instinct, not relational understanding. The same pride that saved Bruce's dignity in earlier chapters now becomes his moral blindness. Inherited violence and the cycle of neglect. Bruce's line, well, I can think of at least one about fathers who failed to provide Bridges' generations of trauma. It connects him back to his own father's absence, showing how familial scars replicate through unacknowledged pain. The moment is also a pause of empathy. Bruce recognizes Thurman not just as a counselor, but as another flawed father navigating failure. Silence as confession. The final beat, Bruce observing Roland's bruises without intervention, embodies the story's recurring motif of inaction as complicity. For all his talk, Bruce cannot face direct confrontation when love demands presence, not protection. The silence resonates louder than any outburst. It is the sound of inherited guilt passing unbroken. Socioeconomic entrapment. Bruce's excuse about working multiple jobs reframes pride as necessity. The counselor's gentle reprimand, you don't get points for that, strikes directly at the novel's larger social critique. Poverty not only erodes material stability, but also steals emotional bandwidth. In a world where survival is a full-time job, affection becomes luxury. Spiritual parallels. Thurman's name is not coincidental. It echoes thorough man, suggesting a completion Bruce lacks. His guidance functions almost as pastoral confession. He's a secular priest listening to a sinner too tired to recognize redemption when offered. Tonal and cinematic precision. The scene's tone oscillates between mundane realism and near-existential intimacy. The rhythm of natural speech, the stuttering, repetition, and ellipses creates authenticity, while the physicality of gesture, rubbing hands, fumbling pockets, conveys emotional truth independent of dialogue. The scene's conclusion plays out cinematically, long take, minimal dialogue, a silent father watching from glass doors as the boy massages his arm, followed by the subtle reveal of being followed by Lysandra Marcelin. That final beat ties psychological guilt to narrative suspense, blending domestic realism with noir foreboding. Symbolic and narrative implications of the final lines. The sudden mention of Lysandra tailing Bruce reframes the intimate father-son tragedy into something mythic, the external world of crime re-entering domestic life. Emotionally, Bruce is at his most vulnerable. Narratively, he is again being hunted by history. The juxtaposition fuses internal collapse with external pursuit. Lysandra's shadow becomes the physical embodiment of the curse Thurman just diagnosed, the ever-present consequence waiting behind every act of neglect and pride. Summary. This scene bridges two emotional worlds, the personal tragedy of neglect and the larger fatalism of inherited sin. It humanizes Bruce beyond the hardened archetype. His inability to name his son's gifts is a microcosm for a generation of men who mistake provision for presence. Thurman's compassion stands as one of the story's purest lights, momentarily illuminating the path Bruce cannot yet walk. By the time the car door shuts and Lysandra's tailing begins, Williams has reestablished the story's dual logic, that love and destruction move together, each feeding the other in the endless cycle of the Edwards curse. 4. Cleotis Marcelin meets Rogelio Rodreguiz. This meeting between Cleotis Marcelin and Rogelio Rodreguiz serves as a crucial moral and thematic pivot in the King's Omen. It dramatizes the instant when pragmatic immorality crosses over into spiritual damnation, showing a man torn between code and necessity forced into complicity by systems of power far greater than his conscience. Stylistically, the scene is stark, cinematic, and psychological. It plays like a negotiation at the gates of hell. Structural and dramatic function. Placed after Cleotis's moral quarrel with his brothers, this sequence acts as the inevitable escalation. The earlier scene established the argument of principle, should they take the job. This one reveals the power structure that nullifies such principle entirely. It is not just about accepting a contract killing, it's about witnessing how crime redefines ethics through hierarchy, fear, and performance. Williams constructs the scene physically and emotionally around verticality, Rogelio on top of his throne, and Cleotis waiting patiently beneath. That spatial imagery visually encodes domination. Cleotis's moral hesitation is literally beneath Rogelio's authority. The power dynamic between seated king and deferential subordinate reflects the novel's obsession with inherited hierarchy, criminal empires mimicking monarchy, obedience masquerading as loyalty. The final handshake seals the moment as ritual rather than transaction. It is a covenantal exchange. The touch symbolizes both business agreement and spiritual contamination. Cleotis's reluctance is clear, but acceptance is demanded through etiquette. His compulsion to be polite mirrors the psychological irony of systemic corruption. Civility enforces obedience to brutality. Character analysis. Cleotis Marcelin. This scene pushes Cleotis past the threshold of ambiguity. Whereas in earlier dialogue, he framed his morals in pragmatic logic. Loyalty means something. Here he encounters pure nihilism embodied in Rogelio's worldview. His silence, as Rogelio instructs him to mutilate the victim, reflects moral collapse, not agreement. He becomes a passive recipient of another man's ideology. The line, "He finally looks up at Cleotis, who is patiently waiting," encapsulates his fundamental flaw, deference to hierarchy. Cleotis's intelligence and instincts are intact, but they're irrelevant in a world that equates hesitation with weakness. By taking the briefcase, he doesn't just accept payment, he inherits Rogelio's worldview. Rogelio Rodreguiz. Rogelio is the archetype of late-stage moral rot, an old king defending a crumbling empire with cruelty masquerading as wisdom. His speech to Cleotis reads like a warped manifesto of survival. Every sentence oscillates between confession and doctrine. He acknowledges failure. "I failed as the leader of my organization," but reasserts power through violence. The irony is that his paranoia and pride are indistinguishable from the fear he seeks to project. When he says, "Remember who you take out, it will always come back to haunt you," he inadvertently predicts his own fate, and, by extension, the cyclical damnation that will later consume Bruce and his descendants. Rogelio's fixation on optics, ensuring the victim's family watches him die, insisting the coroner restructure his face, reveals not sadism for its own sake, but a tyrant's obsession with control through image. Murder becomes theater. Brutality becomes communication. His throne is a newsroom of fear. Thematic analysis. Power and paranoia. Rogelio's monologue articulates the logic of self-destruction that governs systemic evil. His speech, half confession, half justification, is both charming and horrifying because it is coherent. Williams uses this to reveal how corruption maintains itself rhetorically before it acts physically. Power's decay is always explained away as professionalism, inevitability, or tradition. Moral coercion and dehumanization. Cleotis's hesitation is crushed not through direct threat, but through social cues, Rogelio's authority, the ritual of money, and the request for a handshake. Evil in the king's Omen doesn't roar, it politics. The detail that Rogelio demands civility, shake my hand or no deal, illustrates moral inversion at its most chilling, manners weaponized to enforce atrocity. Faith and futility. The repeated Christmas motif stains the act with sacrilege. To schedule a murder on a holy day and justify it as strategic is Williams's bluntest use of irony, religious symbolism corrupted by greed. Cleotis asking, "Does he have a family?" parallels later scenes of Bruce questioning his own worth as a father. Both men are bound by an inability to reconcile compassion with necessity. Inheritance and karma. Rogelio's line about a past enemy returning in a different form is both literal and prophetic. It ties his trauma to the novel's generational framework of violence looping back through bloodlines. He embodies what Bruce becomes decades later, a weary man rationalizing brutality while haunted by family ghosts. Symbolic imagery and cinematic design. The throne, the briefcase, and the handshake are meticulously symbolic. The throne, illusion of stability in a collapsing order. The briefcase, transactional morality, wealth containing both opportunity and curse. The handshake, contamination disguised as contract, intimacy turned into entrapment. Visually, the scene's blocking resembles a stage tableau. Rogelio sits motionless while Cleotis moves. Control is spatialized. The slow, deliberate pacing of their gestures, the pause before opening the briefcase, the walk toward the handshake, allows moral disintegration to happen in real time. Tonal paradox, authority versus despair. Williams writes Rogelio's language with seductive rhythm, letting his cruelty sound eloquent. His dialect, alternating between street familiarity and philosophical self-pity, turns the conversation into a soliloquy of justification. His tone creates the illusion that he's mentoring Cleotis, when in reality he's breaking him. This tonal manipulation mirrors how hierarchical violence sustains itself, through mentorship corrupted by self-interest. Cleotis's few lines puncture that rhythm like conscience trying to surface. I'm married, Rogelio. I have a wife. The appeal to domestic morality goes unanswered, swallowed by Rogelio's monologue. It's a human protest in a mechanized system. The silence that follows his acceptance of the briefcase is therefore the scene's emotional climax. It's a quiet surrender louder than any outburst. Foreshadowing and continuity. This meeting foreshadows multiple narrative trajectories. The collapse of the Marcelin unity, as Cleotis's reluctant compromise will catalyze betrayal. Bruce's inherited curse of moral exhaustion. His handshakes with powerful figures mirror his ancestors' gesture of reluctant submission. The recurring theme that love and loyalty cannot coexist with power. The handshake, in its simplicity, becomes a genealogical symbol, a motion repeated in different centuries under different circumstances, each time marking another moral descent in the Edwards-Marcelin lineage. Closing image. The final tableau, Rogelio grinning while Cleotis bends to meet his hand, perfectly captures the novel's worldview: morality bent before power, conscience humiliated by necessity. It's not just the start of a job, it's the moment the soul begins to rot. When Rogelio says, "Pleasure doing business with you," the line drips with tragic irony, signifying not pleasure, but the satisfaction of victory over another man's conscience. 5. Old Man Bruce's confrontation with the reporter. This sequence between Old Man Bruce and the reporter stands as one of the most revealing and volatile moments in the King's Omen. It collapses decades of crime history, personal mythology, and buried emotion into a tense confrontation between storyteller and skeptic. The scene functions on two levels simultaneously, as oral history, filling in the mythological past of Cleveland's criminal underworld, and as a psychological study of memory, pride, and the fragility of legacy. Structural and narrative significance. The scene's placement is deliberate. Coming after the Cleotis flashbacks and the Rogelio meeting, it roots those mythic episodes within Bruce's subjective storytelling. The reader is pulled back into the present, reminded that all those stories are mediated through Bruce's damaged psyche. This transition is more than narrative, it is existential. The storyteller begins to lose control of his own legend. The conversation also subverts the journalistic frame that has so far felt professional and neutral. The reporter's challenge destroys that balance. Instead of a dialogue, the exchange becomes cross-examination. Emotional authority shifts abruptly. Bruce, once the commanding narrator, becomes destabilized, defensive, and exposed. What follows, with his physical collapse and rage, fuses emotional breakdown with bodily decay. The coughing, drooling, and rage-driven paralysis literalize the spiritual corrosion that has haunted Bruce since the beginning. Memory itself becomes toxic. The act of recounting the past triggers both physical and moral deterioration. Character and psychological dynamics. Bruce Edwards. This is the first time Bruce's narrative mask fractures completely. Up to this point, he has controlled his myth, an aging man framing his sins through nostalgia and selective rationalization. But the reporter's blunt reference to his mother's atrocities dismantles that illusion. Bruce fails to defend her rationally. Instead, his response is primal, a mixture of violence, grief, and denial. His insistence that good people do bad things all the time, but evil people can never be human, encapsulates his moral framework. It's simplistic yet instructive. It reveals his psychological need to separate morality from love. He cannot process the possibility that his mother, Angela Edwards, Lady Scar, could be both. To accept her as complex would mean acknowledging that he, too, inherited that same capacity for darkness. This is not merely filial loyalty, it's self-preservation of identity. Physically, his trembling and coughing externalize guilt as pathology. His body mirrors his conscience, frail, irritated, incapable of holding composure. When he demands to be wheeled outside, the act feels symbolic. He's escaping interrogation, crossing from confession into withdrawal, the same retreat he's executed repeatedly throughout the novel. Yet, even then, his anger endures. The death stare that could kill a demon shows that, even in weakness, Bruce's violence, once external, now survives internally, trapped inside a decaying body. The reporter. The reporter's role transforms from neutral observer to ethical mirror. Until now, he has been an instrument of Bruce's performance. Here, he becomes its disruptor. His straightforward question, whether Angela's revenge killing makes her a monster, serves as the moral hammer cracking Bruce's mythology. The phrasing is innocent but philosophically loaded. By invoking karma and innocent child, he moves from mere curiosity to judgment. This shift exposes the generational chasm between them. For Bruce, morality is tribal and contextual. For the reporter, it's universal and procedural. The reporter's fear after Bruce's reaction completes the irony. Bruce remains dangerous, even when powerless. His compassion after the fact, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean anything by it," reinforces the paradox of the journalist's position, seeker of truth, yet trespasser on sacred memory. The assistant. Her brief intervention humanizes the scene and underscores Bruce's decline. She bridges realms, caretaker and witness, calming chaos without comprehending its moral depth. Her hurried movements and silent efficiency contrast sharply with Bruce's fury, turning the scene almost cinematic, chaotic dialogue inside, cold composure hovering around it. Through her, Williams reminds us that the intimate witness to decay is always ordinary and voiceless. Thematic resonance. Legacy and myth-making. The conversation questions who shapes history, the sinner or the chronicler. Bruce's retelling of gang wars, alliances, and betrayals filters regional crime into moral folklore. The reporter's skepticism signals a larger tension, the battle between mythic honor culture and modern accountability. When Bruce says he was a good man, he just made a few bad decisions, he asserts the criminal code of redemption through loyalty. The reporter's interruption rejects that logic, introducing historical objectivity into a mythic narrative. Good and evil as relational. Bruce's moral schema, monsters can't be human, betrays his limitation. To him, goodness is relational, loyalty, family, while evil is impersonal cruelty, betrayal, massacre. Williams uses this distinction to show how generational trauma rewrites ethics. For Bruce's generation, to love one's own justifies violence against others. The reporter's moral absolutism clashes with that lived code, exposing the distance between morality and memory. The decay of control. Each scene involving Bruce and the reporter chips away at authority. Here, that loss becomes physical. The act of storytelling now harms him, literally choking him. The coughing and trembling symbolize the weight of confession. His voice, once his weapon, is now his punishment. Inheritance of violence. The ghost of Bruce's unborn sibling introduces a new metaphysical thread, sin transmitted not just through behavior, but blood. The folkloric image of the dead child as the mother's guardian spirit merges Catholic superstition with criminal mythology, a haunting fusion of guilt and protection. It's one of the novel's eeriest suggestions that love itself is inseparable from haunting. Tonal construction and symbolic detail. The tone moves from analytical storytelling to emotional implosion in seconds. At first, the dialogue reads like true crime reportage, polished, factual, but as soon as the reporter challenges Bruce's perspective, syntax fractures into visceral rhythm. The sudden chaos of sound, Bruce's coughing, yelling, and gasping, contrasts the earlier intellectual tone, turning the interview scene into a confessional exorcism. Symbolically, the cigarette request becomes Bruce's ritual of denial, his old crutch, a physical plea to retreat into smoke and memory. That cigarette links him to earlier imagery throughout the novel where smoking symbolizes degradation disguised as control. The act of demanding to be wheeled outside, while threatening violence, creates a haunting juxtaposition, fragility posing as dominance. Cinematic and thematic closure. Visually, the final tableau is striking. Bruce outside, lungs collapsing, the reporter left guilt-ridden and unsettled in the wreckage of moral confrontation. The assistant's silence as background sound completes the moment's tragic rhythm, care, fear, and decay fusing into a grim domestic ritual. The lingering image, the frail patriarch still weaponizing aggression, ties the King's Omen's central thesis together. Power doesn't vanish with age. It ferments into bitterness. The old man's fury over his mother's condemnation is not simply filial defense. It's the last gasp of an empire built on loyalty and myth, one that modern morality no longer validates. Williams uses this to transition the narrative from history to reckoning. Bruce's legend is collapsing, his myth becoming mere human weakness under scrutiny. Summary. This scene encapsulates the thematic crossroads of the King's Omen. The collision between myth and truth. The moral confusion between sin and survival. The physical manifestation of guilt. Bruce's outburst is not only about his mother, it's about all the things he can no longer defend, all the ghosts of loyalty now exposed by time. The reporter, by asking one unfiltered question, punctures the illusion that stories can redeem the past. In doing so, he turns the aging gangster's confession into what it has always been, a frail man's desperate attempt to preserve dignity in the face of moral rot. 6. Bruce meets with Kaleb's teacher. This confrontation between Bruce Edwards and Mr. Stewart is one of the most explosively charged episodes in The King's Omen. After the quiet introspection of the counselor scene, this moment reintroduces Bruce's volatility in full force, dramatizing how frustration, racial tension, and paternal guilt fuse into moral combustion. The scene is at once street corner realism and social allegory, the failure of communication between two men who embody separate but equally broken systems. Bruce as the failed head of the working-class family and Stewart as the ineffectual representative of institutional authority. Structural role and narrative momentum. Placed immediately after Bruce's conversation with Thurman, this scene functions as an emotional release valve for the restrained guilt established earlier. Thurman had gently diagnosed Bruce's neglect from a place of compassion. Stewart provokes him from a place of condescension. Structurally, the two scenes are mirrors, both occur in school offices, both involve adult men discussing a child's future, but they offer opposite dynamics. In the first, reason tempers anger. Here, anger eclipses reason. This duality captures the tragic rhythm of Bruce's arc. Every opportunity for redemption is followed by regression. Just when he begins to reach self-awareness, another humiliation, economic, racial, or moral, pulls him back into fury. The Collinwood encounter is not just about Roland's rebellion or Kaleb's science project. It's Bruce's unconscious attempt to rewrite his own failure as father, worker, and man. The school symbolizes the system that judges him and his children. The teacher becomes a proxy for every dismissive power figure he's encountered. Character study. Bruce Edwards. Bruce's behavior in this scene reveals how deeply he conflates dignity with confrontation. His arrival at Collinwood is initially anxious, even tender. His attempt to advocate for Kaleb represents genuine paternal concern. But when Stuart mocks his request, the humiliation reawakens generational anger, the sense of a man constantly unseen, perpetually disrespected. The physical cues, scratching thumbs with fingers, folding arms, the nervous grin, are classic markers of contained violence in Paul M. Williams's prose. Bruce's instincts remain protective, yet his delivery is corrosive. His outburst, "The boy put plenty of effort into that project," feels less like a defense of his son than a defense of his own worth. The intensity with which he protects his children's dignity parallels the intensity with which he's failed to protect his own. His accusation of racism, while emerging from real systemic resentment, is also a deflection of deeper pain. When he declares, "You're part of the reason people are rioting outside of these buildings," he shifts the focus from the individual to the collective, transforming personal humiliation into societal indictment. His rant, half philosophy, half emotional purge, exposes the novel's tragic truth. Bruce's moral insights are valid, but his method of delivery ensures they are dismissed as anger, not justice. Mr. Stuart. Stuart functions as an archetype of bureaucratic authority devoid of empathy. His introduction, chewing disgustingly, ignoring Bruce, challenging him with petty arrogance, immediately establishes him as symbolically tainted. The sensory details of his breath, the food, and his laughter serve a symbolic function, moral decay presented as physical repulsion. He is neither monstrous nor malicious. He is mediocrity weaponized by entitlement. When he responds, "Your son failed himself," his phrasing epitomizes the system's blindness. He reduces a child's isolated failure to a moral statement, erasing context and empathy. Stuart represents the white-collar equivalent of Rogelio's authoritarianism, different arenas, same disdain for compassion. Thematic analysis. Dignity and rage. The central dramatic current is Bruce's tug-of-war between pride and powerlessness. His demand that Kaleb not be failed symbolizes his refusal to let another man, especially one representing a system stacked against him, dictate his children's worth. Yet the irony is that his defense, though emotionally authentic, self-destructs through aggression. Dignity becomes indistinguishable from rage, moral defensiveness from verbal assault. Race and projection. Bruce's accusation, "You're one of them," is layered satire. While he correctly identifies Stuart's condescending prejudices, his racialized generalization mirrors the very dehumanization he resents. Williams uses this to demonstrate how trauma and anger, left unhealed, can calcify into perceptual bias. The scene vibrates with mutual blindness. The white teacher's ignorance of systemic oppression and the black father's exhaustion with being asked to prove his legitimacy. Parenthood and legacy. This is one of the few moments Bruce actively fights for his children rather than mourns them. His fiery monologue about words shaping children's futures is insightful and tragic. He voices the novel's message about how neglect and emotional harm breed rebellion and violence. Ironically, that same invective becomes prophecy. The very passion with which Bruce condemns institutional cruelty mirrors the emotional violence he later inflicts at home. Society's mirror. The hallways filled with noisy children provide a chaotic backdrop, a symbol of innocence flowing around two adults devouring each other with pride. In this setting, Bruce and Stuart become stand-ins for two Americas locked in perpetual miscommunication, one overworked, underseen, and angry, the other dismissive, self-assured, and blind. What should have been a civil exchange about education mutates into an allegory of structural decay. Symbolic and tonal construction. Williams's use of sensory disgust, Mr. Stuart's smelly lunch, visible spit, and food particles, is intentional grotesque realism. It visualizes moral rot. When Bruce bangs the table, it isn't just dramatic, it's an attempt to purify the room of that filth through force. The sound of the bang replaces dialogue, the noise that briefly makes the world listen to him, even if through fear. The tonal shift from social awkwardness to righteous tirade is seamless. Williams's trademark rhythm appears again, long, breathless monologues punctuated by short, sharp lines. This simulates how Bruce's mind spirals, rational thought overwhelmed by emotion. His final words, "You have a nice day, sir," carry the bitter weight of civility recaptured too late. It's not triumph, but resignation after catharsis that changes nothing. Connection to broader narrative. This episode cements Bruce's pattern of moral isolation. Like in the Burgers to Go scene, he begins with good intentions only to sabotage himself through pride. His language evokes empathy, but his tone repels it, leaving him both right and not listened to, a condition mirroring the tragic fate of many working-class and marginalized men in Williams's social universe. Thematically, the scene also echoes Rogelio's monologue to Cleotis, two power systems, crime and education, that demand obedience under the guise of professionalism. Rogelio's command to kill an innocent man on Christmas and Stuart's insistence on rules above compassion stem from the same ideological core, order valued over humanity. Lysandra's silent presence in the parking lot adds an ominous cinematic undertone. The audience knows something Bruce doesn't. His moral and domestic pressures are about to be hijacked by the world he's been trying to avoid. Her watching him walk into the school transforms this private battle into foreshadowed tragedy. Morality, already fragile, is about to encounter temptation again. Final emotional and symbolic image. The final tableau, Stuart speechless, with half-chewed food in his mouth as Bruce storms out, captures the absurdity of their encounter. The man who preaches discipline is left choking. The man seeking respect departs furious and unfulfilled. No one learns, no one heals. The conversation dissolves into silence, leaving disgust as the only truth shared between them. Summary. This scene demonstrates the novel's growing convergence of personal and societal tension. Pride eclipses reason. Race and class distort empathy. Righteous indignation becomes moral isolation. For Bruce, it's a moment of clarity turned self-destruction, a brief flash of moral insight poisoned by rage. For Stuart, it's exposure, his authority mocked and stripped bare. In the grand arc of the King's Omen, this is where Bruce's internal war with pride re-erupts, preparing him for the inevitable re-entry into Lysandra's criminal world, where anger, pride, and desperation will be weaponized once again.